Welcome again to the Explaining History podcast, and I'm very honoured today to be joined by Terence Peterson, who is author of a new fascinating study, Revolutionary Warfare, a history of the counterinsurgency in French Algeria during the Algerian struggle for independence during the 1950s. And it's something that just caught my eye. It is something we underexplore here on the podcast, particularly the issue of Algeria. We talked an awful lot about decolonization and the wars of decolonization, but actually the ways in which colonizers sought to fight back against revolutionary warfare, I think is hugely underexplored. So, firstly, welcome, Terence. It's a pleasure to have you today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay. So we were just before the recording began discussing a little bit about the kind of the thesis behind the book and your particular interest in this kind of question, really, this enigma, really, around French motivations, tactics, and what they're seeking to achieve in Algeria. Perhaps you can begin by telling us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so, the Algerian War is one of these sort of key conflicts, armed conflicts of the Cold War and of the period of decolonization, right? You could set it alongside Kenya, the suppression of the Mau Mau, alongside, the troubles in Ireland. Often it's sort of studied in tandem with Malaya or Vietnam, right? And the sort of question at the outset of this project, the thing that always got me curious was like, why? Right? We still look at the Algerian War as this really important conflict for understanding modern counterinsurgency, but the French army lost.
Yeah.
Right. So why is this conflict that's ultimately a failed effort such a core case study of counterinsurgency? And so I set out to, really get a sense of like, why are French ideas so influential? How are French officers articulating new frameworks for understanding war amidst the Cold War? What are they actually doing on the ground? Does it match up with what they say?
And when we talk about kind of counterinsurgency warfare, we're talking about some pretty brutal and bloody and very, very kind of criminal, I suppose, in some ways, approaches to dealing with suppressing a revolt. Just to kind of place it in a sort of a context, you're in this period of time, aren't you, where both the French and the British empires are within their last couple of decades. Does the way in which the French fought in Algeria give an indication as to their sort of desperation?
I think so. The story that's often told about the Algerian War is that, it's fought by this French army that's just suffered a massive defeat in Dien Bien Phu, that's, really committed to winning at any cost. And I think this is true, right? The French Empire at the moment is sort of coming apart at the seams. Decolonization is this global phenomenon that sort of accrues, right? The more newly independent countries you have, the larger voice they have calling for the independence of other countries. You've got late in the Algerian War, the Vietnamese government giving military aid to the Algerian National Liberation Front. But one of the things I actually try to counter in the book is this idea that it's all just desperation, right? That it's these sort of like traumatized lost soldiers that have been off fighting in the colonies by themselves for decades. Really, I try to also situate the war in this project of post-1945 reconstruction.
Right.
So France is rebuilding itself and its empire, which it rechristens the French Union, in the aftermath of World War II. And this is a really long process. And that effort to reimagine what France and the French Empire might look like in a post-Holocaust, post-World War II world really gets folded into this project of counterinsurgency. So it's intensely violent, but it also has a weird sort of constructive aim in that it's seeking to build something new as it's, violently repressing Algerians who are participating in the national liberation movement.
Yeah, and that itself is a really fascinating observation in that you've had this country that after 1947 this national humiliation. There is effectively throughout the French Empire a civil war that wages parallel to the Second World War, and then you have right from late 1945 onwards, essentially a war emerging in Vietnam. And so you'd be forgiven for thinking that French, the French worldview would be entirely reactive. Oh my goodness, what terrible thing is happening to our empire next? But from what you're saying, it's not entirely like that. There is a kind of a vision for a kind of a sort of like a formation of a future imperial polity, I suppose.
Yeah, so this takes place on the civilian side, right? So the French government's thinking about how can we restructure the economy? How can we reform land ownership? How can we change wages and social benefits, both in France and Algeria, to draw the countries closer together to sort of form a post-war social consensus. And then you've got a military that, in the wake of the defeat in 1940 and then again in 1954 in Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, is undergoing this intense process of reformation, right? Both structurally in terms of how officers are promoted and the sort of command structures of the military, but also in terms of its doctrines and how it's understanding the world. And these things converge into this sort of utopian project to rebuild Algeria, right? The civilian government thinks that reform is a way to undercut the sort of grievances of Algerians who have long been excluded from many rights and have been had their land expropriated and these sorts of things. They think, structural change is a way to sort of undercut those demands and wipe out nationalism. And the military is thinking structurally as well. And the only sort of institution that's capable of acting in Algeria, really effectively is the military. And so it sort of takes on these civilian tasks and combines it with its own sort of vision of internal reform. And this is really what leads it to see, the project of what they call counter-revolutionary warfare, right? Yeah. Or pacification. These sort of euphemisms come to represent a sort of like set of distinct tactics, right, that are aimed both at destroying the perceived enemy amidst the population, pulling up the FLN root and branch, but also restructuring Algerian society at the same time. And it's ostensibly progressive, but of course, always carried out through intensely violent methods, even the more sort of cultural, social aspects that aren't using kinetic force.
Sure. And when you look at, say, for example, American efforts in Vietnam, there's always a distinct sort of failure in understanding, the political dynamics and social, cultural, and religious dynamics of Vietnam. American officers fighting the war in Vietnam don't really understand how the country works. Is that the same for the French in Algeria? Are they blind to the kind of the sort of social and cultural and political roots of insurgency? They're just sort of...
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case, right? Algeria has been at this point in 1954, when the war breaks out, a French colony for almost 130 years. And there's a whole body of like ethnographic and religious and scholarly expertise about North Africa and about Algerians specifically. But the French army ironically finds that like they don't have enough expertise. They don't really understand how things work, right? They don't even have like enough people who actually speak Arabic or Darija or Tamazight or some of these languages that are in Algeria, right? As they're looking for officers who can sort of be the man on the spot, what they call a special administrative section, a guy who commands a big circumscription and holds both civilian and military powers. They lay out, and initially they say, we're going to find all these guys who speak Arabic and like understand North Africa, and they can't find them. Right? Yeah. They just simply don't have the personnel. And I think that sort of misunderstanding of Algerian society informs their efforts on a very basic level, right? One of the strategies they come up with to sort of, fight intrusion of clandestine insurgents on the part of the FLN, and try to bind the Algerian population to the French military, is to set up these village councils.
Mhm.
Right. And the idea is that they're going to take the Jama, which is this traditional sort of democratic grassroots structure where the heads of families meet together and reach a sort of consensus. And they're going to make like a French version of it, a
Mhm.
French-led version of it. And, those guys are going to be able to sort of like politically manipulate villages into supporting the French cause. Well, I mean, that idea at its very base totally misunderstands how the Jama works, right? This sort of communal consensus building, problem resolving council that's been around for years and years, right? Even the FLN can't quite master that as a tool for recruitment. So just imagine you have these French officers who speak very little or no Arabic, and have this sort of uh, supremacist vision of French culture, a sense that they can dictate the way that they can restructure Algerian culture on the ground, right? They're sort of not really listening to Algerians. So this sort of fundamental disconnect between the way Algerians are experiencing French pacification or counterinsurgency efforts and the way that the French think those are operating is the fatal flaw that undermines them, right? The thing that takes the French by shock is in December 1960, Algerians sort of rise up en masse, not motivated by the FLN, but just by like popular anger at this repression, and protest in multiple cities and sort of reoccupy space. And the French army is sort of left holding the bag, thinking like, what's going on here? We don't understand. None of these people are members of the FLN. Like, where did this come from, right? And it
Yeah.
has to do with that fundamental misunderstanding.
Yeah. And where are they in this story? Where are the colonists, the French colonists? Because I'm guessing the majority of French soldiers you're talking about aren't actual. They weren't, French nationals born in Algeria. These are people coming from outside. Where are the colonists in all of this?
So they're involved in a lot of cases, but we have to remember the French military is huge, right? At its height, there's something like 450,000 troops deployed on active duty in Algeria. And so you have a mix of people, right? The vast majority of those troops are conscripts, many of them drawn from the metropole, many of them drawn from Algeria itself, right? The French army makes an effort to organize sort of self-defense groups out of European settlers in Algeria and out of Algerians themselves. But the strategic thinking here is actually largely metropolitan and colonial officers from outside Algeria, right? You of course have some pied noirs, some settler officers in there, right? They're in the colonial army, they're in the Army of Africa, but many of these thinkers are sort of arriving in Algeria thinking like this is the gem of our empire and recognizing many of the same problems as elsewhere and saying like, what is going on? Like, why are there so many problems? In a lot of cases, actually, they blame the settlers, right? And so the dynamic between sort of settler ultras who support French Algeria militantly, often, in armed ways, and the military, it sort of fluctuates throughout the war, right? There are times when the military command looks at settlers in really negative ways, like blames them for all of the problems in Algeria and says it can't possibly be France. It's just the settlers, right? There's something corrupted about the original civilizing mission in Algeria. And then there's other times in 1958 and afterward that the army command starts to look at the settler bloc as a really key body of support. And in fact, you have a sort of splintering of opinions within the army, where you have some officers who then ally themselves with the most radical elements of the sort of settler militants to carry out sort of paramilitary violence. And many of these officers then break off with these radical settlers to form what's called the Secret Army Organization, which is a terrorist organization that attacks both the French military and the National Liberation Front once it's clear that Algeria is going to get its independence.
Yeah, and you find there's some interesting parallels with the European settler colonial kind of mentality in Vietnam. I'm reading a fantastic book. It's one I've been trying to finish for about a decade now, but I'm a small child, and but um, a fantastic book, Fight or Flight by Martin Thomas, which he talks an awful lot about how belligerent the French colonists in Vietnam were at a time when the French government is sort of getting slightly cold feet about Vietnam and thinking, well, we have got bigger problems to deal with. And a lot of the kind of the escalation and the aggression and the refusal to make any sorts of compromises with the North Vietnamese national movement comes from the settlers as opposed necessarily to the French government itself. And in that is a lot of, I suppose, kind of white supremacy and the general stuff you tend to get with white settler colonialism in Africa or Asia. Are there kind of echoes of that in the kind of the colonial mentality in Algeria?
Yeah, I mean, again, that dynamic sort of shifts over the war, but right, Martin Thomas has done a great job of sort of tracing this dynamic across various geographic locations, right? He's written on North Africa as well. When the sort of initial efforts of the French government to, carry out these structural reforms to abolish the indigénat, which is this, really punitive penal code just for indigenous subjects, right? Settlers are not subject to this code. This all meets with enormous opposition, right? The settler population is opposed to the sort of ostensibly progressive reforms laid out by the army and the civil administration in Algeria. And I say ostensibly because these reforms are also informed by a sort of, French supremacy of sorts that sees, French culture as the model to aspire to. And if only we can make Algerians more French, they'll somehow be more civilized, right? This is an idea that's well rooted. That's also informing, sort of more explicit forms of racism that many settler groups embrace, right? But you have a sort of convergence around 1958 when de Gaulle comes back to power, and what happens is essentially settlers occupy the seat of government in Algeria, start burning papers and ransacking the main building, and the French military swoops in, declares a committee of public safety, which is a term that harkens back to the French Revolution, right? They assume all civil powers in North Africa. It provokes a crisis. And Charles de Gaulle, the hero of World War II, comes back to power as president, right? And there's a sort of an alliance then formed between the military and the settler militants, right? They accept that this sort of old form of colonialism based on strict spatial separation, what the situation in Algeria looks a lot like apartheid in places. They sort of understand that that's not sustainable anymore. But earlier on, the French government recognizes this reticence to the point that it's sort of like, it thinks about like, maybe we should partition Algeria like India was partitioned. Maybe we should create, kibbutzes, like armed white settlements, that are independent from an Algeria that's had power devolved to Algerians. All these solutions sort of fall through in large part because settlers don't want to negotiate on any of that, right? For them, it's like French Algeria or nothing.
Yeah. And throughout a lot of these, where you see actual settler colonialism, be it British, French, or any other variety, there's often this kind of deep skepticism about the metropole from the colonists, and a sense of impending betrayal. They're gonna eventually this will get too much hard work for them, and they'll dump, as you see. And it becomes, I suppose, in some ways like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you do then get that kind of entirely belligerent, unwilling to compromise and yielding attitude. And I think that in itself comes from the kind of the mentality of settler colonialism, where you find settlers who view themselves as small little outposts of civilization surrounded by the savages. You know, we have to be very, very careful around these awful
Yeah.
people that we rule over. Just to talk a little bit about what, in terms of counterinsurgency, what did the French actually learn? What were the principles of counterinsurgency that became so popular with other regimes?
You know, so they develop a system, right? And I think that's the new thing, right? They develop a really sort of portable, clear, multi-step system for how to pacify a population. And I think it captures the sort of zeitgeist of the moment in that it sort of assumes that indigenous people or people in general are manipulable and can be made to do what they want if only you follow these series of steps. And I think that sort of answers the question of, you know, if one of my initial questions was like, why is the French method so influential, right? Part of it is that they create this really portable, universal sounding doctrine
Yeah,
that doesn't innovate so much as like capture the mood of the moment,
yeah,
right? A lot of the actual techniques they're drawing on are drawn from this long heritage of colonial warfare. They're drawn from things the French are doing in other areas, right? So this idea of, you know, creating these jama, these village councils linked to the French military and the French state, that actually comes from Morocco, from the Rif War in the 1920s, right? You have this Lyotéen tradition that sort of developed over the 20, 30, 40 years leading up to the Algerian War that they draw really heavily on. You know, a lot of the ideas about marking out forbidden zones and forcibly removing rural communities to what they call regroupment villages, right?
yeah,
This sort of forcible resettlement of the countryside, you know, where you put people in ostensible new villages that are really just barbed wire camps, and then kill anybody who's sort of outside the bounds of you know, the places where you've allowed them to exist. That idea comes from Madagascar and from Indochina, from Vietnam, right?
yeah,
So they're really what they're doing in Algeria. The French army is taking a bunch of methods it's developed, reworking them in light of this sort of goal of refounding Algerian society, and creating this really clearly structured set of you know, operations and procedures. I mean, they're like numbered. You know, they you know, destroy, protect, you know, engage, inform. They have these sort of words that embody this sort of idea of each stage, and that's really the innovative new product, right? They're sort of saying war is new. We've figured it out because of all
yeah.
these wars we've fought, and here's some steps to fight this new form of war. And the ideas they're in are really not actually that radically new.
And you have, I mean, if you think of the first half of the 20th century, you've had two periods of kind of inter-empire war. You know, the First World War, and then the Second World War. I think Richard Overy recently, when he was writing about the Second World War, I say recently, it's probably a book that's about 5 years old, but it's relatively recently, talked about the idea that the Second World War can best be thought of as you have established empires like Britain and France fending off kind of aggressive, hungry competitors. And I think it's quite a good way of looking at it. And then finally, you have weakened empires who have to then discover entirely new ways of fighting, based on not on a rival like Imperial Japan or Nazi Germany, but on actual insurgencies from within. So from Britain fighting in Malaya, and I guess to some extent in Palestine, and Britain, you know, potentially prepared, actually, I think far more so than is realised, to fight on in India, and then France in Vietnam and Madagascar and in Algeria, all fighting this kind of historical landslide that's coming their way, and having to kind of remodel their tactics. I think the interesting thing that you said was that actually some of these practices pioneered by the French were taken up not by anti-colonial, counterinsurgencies in anti-colonial wars, but by things like South American dictatorships, um, and that those kinds of regimes. So it was obviously applied in all sorts of different contexts.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think, it's great that you brought up World War II, right? Because I think we tend to sometimes emphasize the colonial heritage too much, and we forget about like how profoundly transformative and traumatizing World War II was, right? And I think the vision of warfare that's shared not just across the French officer corps, but really across militaries, with the British military, with the American military, in this period is really shaped by World War II, right? And what all these, and I should note that all these militaries are collaborating all this time, right?
Mm.
The French send officers to Malaya to see what the British are doing. The British and the French sign an agreement to pair off officers. Like one pair will go to Algeria and observe the command, another will go to Kenya and observe the command. They're trading officers for really the first time. The first time after 1945, they're
Yeah,
trading large number of high-ranking officers at the national war colleges like Sandhurst or the French War College in Paris, and they all sort of see war as having been transformed to focus not only on territory but also on population,
hmm,
right? And they're looking at both communists in the Soviet Union and in Indochina and what the Nazi government did as a sort of a precept, right? They believe that modern social science by these authoritarian governments has discovered a way to manipulate people in new ways, and that means that frontiers, I mean, you have all these treatises by French officers that say frontiers are worthless, right? Little pins stuck in maps don't matter because now modern warfare occurs in all domains: psychological, economic, social, right? And one of the key ways that you win modern warfare is by protecting your civilian population from subversion, right? You
yeah,
can see how this anti-communist, element, this concern about subversion, tracks in both the colonial context and in place like
oh yeah,
Argentina, right, where you have popular uprisings, you have a military junta that's trying to quash them, that's intensely concerned about communist intrusion from Cuba. This sort of idea that the population is the new battleground
yeah.
is the sort of key ontological assumption of the Cold War.
And that's a fascinating sort of snapshot of this kind of shift in mentalities away, as you say, from controlling territories to controlling populations. I mean, a fair bit of the efforts that civilian governments did during World War II was, controlling populations from subversion and making sure people were thinking right and helpful things to carry on and buy war
Yeah.
bonds and things like that. But this is on a whole other scale. This is preventing, this kind of contagion of what is often mislabeled as communism during the Cold War. And you're really talking about kind of people with national liberation goals and aspirations.
Yeah.
Yeah, may sometimes be a bit left wing, may sometimes not be quite so socialist. Um, we're coming to an end in a moment. So just a quick plug for the book. I'm guessing it's currently available in all good bookstores. Is that correct?
It's not quite. It's available for pre-order, right?
Okay.
It will be out September 15th, and the full title is Revolutionary Warfare: How the Algerian War Made Modern Counterinsurgency.
Fantastic. Well, what I'll do is I'll put a pre-order link in the podcast notes and things like that for anyone to click on. Obviously, if you can purchase it from an independent book retailer, as we always say on the podcast, please do. The big warehouses, which we shall not name for legal reasons, they don't need any more of your money, but the little guys do. So please do support them if you can do. Um, there's so much more to unpack on this one, and it would be a pleasure to talk to you again in the future if you do have the time to talk about counterinsurgency warfare and all matters of kind of decolonization and that sort of thing. So yes, it'd be great to continue if you have the time in the future.
Yeah, that would be lovely. I'm always excited to talk about counterinsurgency with anybody who will listen.
Well, this is the thing about when you have a niche topic of interest, isn't it? It's so great to be able to discuss it. Um, so we'll finish there. But Terence, it was an absolute pleasure to talk with you today, and I'm so very grateful for your time. All the very best with the book when it comes out, and remind me, and I'll give it an extra plug on the podcast when it's available for fully ordering.
Great. Thanks so much, Nick. It was such a pleasure to be on.